The dressing room door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the empty corridor. Michael Jackson pressed his back against the cold metal, his sequined jacket feeling suddenly too tight, too heavy, too much. Outside, 75,000 fans were chanting his name at Madison Square Garden, their voices creating a thunder that shook the walls. But inside this small, fluorescent-lit space, the king of pop was having a panic attack that threatened to end his career before the show even began. What happened in the next 12 minutes would either destroy everything he'd built or reveal a truth about fame, loneliness, and human connection that would change how the world saw him forever. But first, you need to understand how Michael Jackson ended up locked in a dressing room, unable to breathe, 30 minutes before the biggest performance of his 1995 History World Tour. It was November 8, 1995, and Michael Jackson was supposed to be celebrating. The History album had dominated charts worldwide. His choreography was being copied by dancers on every continent, and this Madison Square Garden show was completely sold out with celebrities, industry executives, and devoted fans filling every seat. But success had become Michael's prison. For months, the media had been relentless. Tabloid headlines questioned everything about him: his appearance, his personal life, his relationships, his motivations. Every photograph was analyzed, every public appearance dissected, every gesture interpreted as evidence of something sinister or strange. The pressure had been building like steam in a sealed container, and tonight in this dressing room, it finally exploded. Michael's assistant, Karen Fay, had been with him since the early days. She'd watched him transform from the confident performer who could command any stage into someone who needed 20 minutes of silence and meditation just to walk into a rehearsal. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, Karen found Michael sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, hyperventilating so badly he couldn't speak. His hands were shaking, his eyes were unfocused, and in 30 minutes, he was supposed to walk onto that stage and deliver a performance that millions of people would watch and judge. "Michael, breathe with me," Karen said softly, kneeling beside him. But Michael shook his head violently. "I can't do this anymore. I can't be him anymore." The words came out broken, desperate. "Everyone out there, they don't see me. They see what they want to see. A freak, a headline, a monster. But nobody sees." Karen had never heard Michael this vulnerable, this broken. In all their years together, through all the controversies and challenges, he'd always found a way to put on the mask, to become the performer the world expected. But something had shifted tonight. Something had finally broken through. The trigger had been simple, almost ridiculous in its mundanity. Before coming to the venue, Michael had stopped at a small bookstore near his hotel, wearing a disguised baseball cap, sunglasses, plain jacket. For 10 beautiful minutes, he'd browsed the shelves like a normal person, enjoying the anonymity. Then a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, had recognized him. "Oh my God, it's Michael Jackson," she'd screamed. Within seconds, what had been a peaceful moment became chaos. People rushed toward him with cameras, shouting questions, demanding autographs, touching him, grabbing at his clothes. Security had to physically remove him from the store, while the manager apologized profusely, and the crowd outside grew larger and more aggressive. But that wasn't what broke him. What broke Michael was what he'd overheard as security pushed through the crowd. A middle-aged man, filming with his camera, had said to his companion, "Look at him running away. Guilty people always run. There must be truth to all those stories." That single comment, delivered with such certainty by someone who'd never met him, never spoken to him, never tried to understand his story, that's what shattered Michael's carefully maintained composure, because it confirmed his deepest fear, that no matter what he did, no matter how much good he tried to create in the world, people would always choose to believe the worst about him. Now, sitting in this dressing room with his assistant trying to help him breathe, Michael realized he'd reached a breaking point. He could continue being Michael Jackson, the performer, the icon, the carefully constructed public persona, or he could finally, truly, be himself, even if the world rejected him for it. The choice seemed impossible. If he went on stage and delivered the expected performance, he'd be perpetuating the very image that was suffocating him. But if he showed his real self, his vulnerability, his pain, wouldn't that just give his critics more ammunition? Wouldn't that prove what they'd been saying all along, that something was wrong with him? "Karen," Michael whispered, his breathing starting to slow slightly. "What if tonight? What if I just told them the truth?" Karen looked at him with concern. "What truth, Michael?" Michael met her eyes, and she saw something she hadn't seen in years, a spark of determination mixed with absolute terror. All of it, what it's really like, what fame actually does to a person, what it feels like to be constantly judged by people who've never tried to understand you. The idea was radical, possibly career-ending. Michael Jackson didn't do confessional performances. He did spectacle. He did perfection. He did what audiences expected and demanded. Breaking that contract even once could have consequences that rippled through everything he'd built. But Michael was drowning, and drowning people will grab onto anything, even if it means pulling down the very structure keeping them afloat. "I need to try," Michael said, standing up on shaky legs, "even if it destroys everything. Even if they crucify me for it. I need them to see that I'm human. That underneath all of this," he gestured at his elaborate costume, his styled hair, his famous appearance, "I'm just a person who's tired of being treated like a commodity." Karen made a decision that would later be called either incredibly brave or professionally reckless. Instead of calling the tour manager, instead of alerting the producers, she simply nodded and helped Michael fix his appearance. "Then let's give them something real," she said quietly. "Let's show them the man, not just the moonwalk." Michael took a deep breath and walked toward the door. Behind it, he could hear the roar of the crowd growing louder, more impatient. They wanted a show. They wanted to be entertained. They wanted Michael Jackson. But tonight, for the first time and longer than he could remember, Michael was going to try giving them something more valuable and far more dangerous: the truth. The walk from the dressing room to the stage felt like traveling through a tunnel where time moved differently. Each step seemed to take forever and no time at all. Michael's band members looked at him with concern as he passed. They could see something was different tonight. Something was off about his usual pre-show energy. His dancers, who'd rehearsed every move thousands of times, noticed the way he moved. Slower, more deliberate, less like the precision machine they'd practiced with, and more like someone carrying an enormous weight. But nobody stopped him. Nobody questioned him. The show must go on, after all. That's the first rule of entertainment. The performer's feelings, struggles, humanity, those are secondary to the audience's expectations and the production schedule. Michael reached his starting position in the darkness beneath the stage. In 60 seconds, the hydraulic platform would lift him up into the lights, and 75,000 people would scream his name. He could hear them chanting now, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to match his heartbeat. "Michael! Michael! Michael!" Each repetition felt like it was demanding something from him, extracting something essential. In all his years of performing, Michael had never felt this disconnected from the role he was supposed to play. Usually, the moment before going on stage was almost meditative, a space where Michael Jackson the person transformed into Michael Jackson the performer, where vulnerability became confidence, where doubt became certainty. But tonight, standing in the darkness with the platform beginning to rise, Michael made a decision that terrified him more than any dance move or vocal challenge ever had. He decided not to transform. He decided to carry his vulnerability onto that stage, to bring his doubt and pain and humanity with him, and to somehow make that part of the performance, rather than something to be hidden behind elaborate choreography and spectacle. The platform rose, the lights hit him, and 75,000 people erupted in the kind of hysteria that only Michael Jackson could generate. But instead of launching into his opening number, instead of hitting his first mark and starting the carefully choreographed sequence that his dancers were prepared for, Michael did something nobody expected. He walked to the front of the stage and raised his hand for silence. The gesture was so unexpected, so outside the script, that the band stopped playing. The dancers froze, and the crowd, confused but curious, gradually quieted down. When Michael finally spoke, his voice wasn't the confident performer's voice that filled stadiums. It was quieter, more uncertain, more human. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said, and even through the massive speaker system you could hear the vulnerability. "But before we start this show, I need to tell you something. I need to be honest with you about what's really happening here." The confusion in the arena was palpable. This wasn't part of the show. The production crew was frantically trying to figure out if this was some new opening they hadn't been told about, or if something was genuinely wrong. Michael's tour manager was speaking urgently into his headset, asking if they should cut to commercial for the television broadcast, if they should pause the show, if they needed to intervene. But Michael continued, and his next words would either end his career or redefine what it meant to be a performer in the modern age. "I'm exhausted," Michael said simply. "Not physically, though that too, but exhausted from pretending, from being what everyone expects instead of who I actually am. Tonight I thought about canceling this show. I thought about running away. Because the person you came to see, I don't know if I can be him anymore." The silence in Madison Square Garden was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop in the furthest seat. 75,000 people were holding their collective breath, uncertain whether they were witnessing a breakdown or a breakthrough, whether this was brilliant performance art or genuine crisis. "Every day," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger but no less vulnerable, "I read things about myself that aren't true. Every day, people analyze my appearance, my behavior, my choices, and they create stories about who I am without ever asking me, without ever wondering if maybe, just maybe, I'm a person who has feelings and struggles just like everyone else. He paused, and in that pause, you could feel the entire arena leaning forward, desperate to hear what would come next. Tonight, I could give you the show you expected. I could moonwalk and spin and hit every mark perfectly. And for 2 hours, you'd be entertained and I'd be performing. But then we'd all go home, and nothing would have changed. You'd still see me as this thing, this idea of a person rather than an actual human being. Michael looked out at the sea of faces, some confused, some concerned, some starting to show understanding. So instead, I'm asking you to try something different with me tonight. I'm going to perform for you, yes, but I'm going to do it as myself, as Michael, not as Michael Jackson the product. I'm going to show you what it actually looks like when someone tries to create art while carrying the weight of constant judgment, constant scrutiny, constant misrepresentation. And I'm asking you to watch not as fans consuming entertainment, but as fellow human beings witnessing another person's truth. What happened next at Madison Square Garden was unprecedented in the history of modern entertainment. Michael Jackson, the king of pop, the most famous performer on the planet, began a concert unlike any he'd ever done. Instead of launching into the high-energy opening that audiences expected, he started with Stranger in Moscow, a song he'd never performed live before, a deeply personal track about isolation and alienation. But he performed it differently than anyone had heard it. He performed it like a confession, like a prayer, like someone finally allowing the world to see his wounds. As Michael sang, something shifted in the arena. The initial confusion gave way to something deeper, recognition. Because while 75,000 people couldn't relate to being the most famous person on earth, they could relate to feeling misunderstood. They could relate to carrying pain that others couldn't see. They could relate to wanting desperately to be seen for who they really were, rather than who people assumed them to be. Michael moved across the stage not with his usual precise choreography, but with raw emotion that made every gesture feel spontaneous, genuine, real. When he sang about loneliness, you could see it in his body language. When he sang about longing for connection, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd been isolated by his own fame. The dancers, initially thrown by the deviation from the planned show, began to adapt. Instead of executing their rehearsed routines, they responded to Michael's energy, creating something that looked less like choreography and more like visual poetry. The lighting designer, realizing what was happening, made split-second decisions to illuminate Michael in ways that emphasized his vulnerability rather than his spectacle. The entire production, despite having no rehearsal for this approach, was organically transforming to support Michael's raw honesty. But the real magic was happening in the audience. People were crying, not the excited tears of fans seeing their idol, but the cathartic tears of people recognizing their own pain reflected back at them. Concert footage from that night shows audience members holding each other, sharing tissues, looking at the stage with expressions of wonder and recognition. Because Michael wasn't just performing anymore, he was sharing his humanity, and in doing so, he was giving 75,000 people permission to acknowledge their own. When the song ended, the applause was different from the usual concert cheering. It was quieter, more sustained, more reverent. Michael stood at the front of the stage, tears visible on his face under the lights, and for the first time and longer than he could remember, he felt seen, not as Michael Jackson the icon, but as Michael the person who hurt and hoped and struggled just like everyone else. "Thank you," he said softly. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for seeing me." Then, with a small smile that carried both sadness and hope, he added, "Now, should we try a real show? Because I think we've earned the right to actually enjoy this together." The energy in the arena shifted again, not back to where it had been, but to something new. When Michael launched into Black or White, the crowd's response was electric, but it was different. They weren't just consuming entertainment now. They were participating in something more intimate, more real, more human. The rest of the concert became legendary. Not for its technical perfection, which was somewhat compromised by the spontaneous changes, but for its emotional authenticity. Michael performed songs he'd never done live before, songs that revealed different facets of his experience. He talked between numbers, sharing stories about his childhood, his struggles with fame, his hope that art could heal both the artist and the audience. He even brought up his earlier panic attack, describing it with humor and honesty that made the crowd gasp at his vulnerability and then laugh at his self-awareness. During Earth Song, Michael stopped mid-performance and asked the audience a question that nobody expected. "How many of you feel like nobody really understands you?" The response was overwhelming. Thousands of hands shot up throughout the arena. Michael nodded slowly, looking at all those raised hands. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Me too. Every single day." It was a moment of profound connection. A superstar and his audience discovering their shared humanity in the most unlikely place, the middle of a sold-out concert at Madison Square Garden. The show ran 40 minutes longer than scheduled because Michael kept adding unplanned elements, acoustic performances, spontaneous dance breaks, extended conversations with the audience about creativity, judgment, and the courage required to be authentic in a world that constantly demands conformity. His tour manager was having a meltdown backstage about the television broadcast schedule, but nobody cared. Something more important than logistics was happening on that stage. When Michael performed Man in the Mirror as the show's climax, he changed the context completely. Instead of the triumphant anthem it usually was, he performed it as a challenge to himself and to the audience. "If you want to make the world a better place," he sang, "take a look at yourself and make a change." But then he stopped the music and spoke directly to the crowd. "That includes me. That includes all of us. We have to change how we treat each other. We have to stop judging without understanding. We have to start seeing the humanity in people, even people who seem different or strange or impossible to understand." The final moments of the concert were simple. Michael stood at the edge of the stage, looking out at 75,000 people who had come for entertainment and received something far more valuable. "Tonight was scary for me," he admitted, "breaking the script, showing you who I really am instead of who you expected. I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to do this again, but I'm grateful that you gave me the space to try." The standing ovation lasted for 12 minutes. People weren't just applauding the performance, they were acknowledging the risk Michael had taken, the vulnerability he'd shown, the gift he'd given them by choosing truth over perfection. The aftermath of that Madison Square Garden performance created shockwaves that extended far beyond the entertainment industry, fundamentally changing conversations about fame, mental health, and the cost of celebrity in ways that would influence culture for decades. The immediate response from critics was divided. Some reviewers called it the greatest performance of Michael Jackson's career, a masterclass in emotional honesty that transcended entertainment. Others criticized it as unprofessional, self-indulgent, and a concerning sign of instability. But what critics said mattered less than what audiences felt. Bootleg recordings of the concert spread rapidly, passed from person to person in the pre-social media era, through VHS tapes and eventually early internet file sharing. People who hadn't been there watched it and felt the same connection that the live audience had experienced. Mental health organizations began using clips from the performance in their awareness campaigns, highlighting Michael's honest discussion of his panic attack as an example of how even seemingly successful people struggled with invisible challenges. Michael himself was transformed by the experience in ways both liberating and complicated. In interviews following the concert, he was more candid than ever before about his struggles with fame, though he was careful to frame his honesty in ways that couldn't be weaponized by tabloids. "That night taught me something important," he told Oprah Winfrey months later. "I learned that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's actually the strongest thing we can offer each other, our true selves, even when we're scared of rejection." The entertainment industry took notice in unexpected ways. Other performers began incorporating more authentic, unscripted moments into their shows. The rigid perfectionism that had dominated concert productions gave way to occasional glimpses of the real person behind the performance. Artists started talking more openly about the psychological toll of fame, the pressure to maintain impossible standards, the loneliness that could exist even in front of cheering crowds. But perhaps the most profound impact was on how audiences engaged with celebrities. The Madison Square Garden performance became a reference point in conversations about parasocial relationships, the ethics of judgment, and the responsibility audiences have toward the people they elevate to fame. It planted seeds for future discussions about mental health in the entertainment industry, about the costs of constant scrutiny, about the humanity of people who exist in the public eye. Michael's relationship with performing evolved after that night. While he never again abandoned the scripted precision of his choreographed shows, he incorporated more moments of genuine connection, more opportunities for spontaneous interaction, more willingness to show imperfection. His dancers reported that he seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the impossible standards he'd set for himself. Karen Fay, who'd been there in the dressing room before it all began, noted that Michael seemed to breathe easier after finally being seen. The concert became legendary not just for what happened during it, but for what it represented, a moment when someone at the absolute peak of fame chose truth over image, vulnerability over perfection, humanity over spectacle. Years later, When mental health awareness in the entertainment industry became a more mainstream concern, people would point back to that November night in New York as an early important moment of reckoning. Today, when young performers talk about the pressure of fame, when celebrities discuss their struggles with public perception, when artists advocate for the right to be imperfect humans rather than perfect products, they're walking a path that Michael Jackson helped create on that stage. The concert footage remains powerful because it captures something rare and precious, a genuine moment of human connection. In an industry built on carefully constructed artifice, Michael's willingness to risk everything, his reputation, his career, his carefully managed image for the chance to be seen as fully human rather than partially divine, that choice resonated beyond entertainment. It became a cultural touchstone for conversations about authenticity, vulnerability, and the courage required to show your real self in a world that profits from your persona. The story serves as a powerful reminder that our greatest moments often emerge not from our most polished performances, but from our willingness to break the script and show the world who we really are, even when we're terrified of rejection. Michael Jackson, the most famous performer on earth, taught 75,000 people, and eventually millions more, that being seen for who you truly are is worth any risk, any judgment, any consequence, because in the end, what transforms us isn't perfection or spectacle or carefully managed image. What transforms us is the courage to be vulnerable, to be honest, to be human, even under the brightest spotlight in the world.